The alarm didn't wake Marcus Johnson. He was already standing at the bedroom window when it went off at 5:30, one hand braced against the frame, watching the street below settle into the gray, pre-dawn quiet of a Portsmouth morning in late March. He reached back without looking and silenced it before the second pulse. 16 years of pre-dawn briefings had rewired something in his nervous system that no amount of civilian life had managed to touch. He didn't sleep through alarms. He didn't sleep through much of anything. The street was empty. A pickup he didn't recognize was parked 2 houses down, which he noted and filed. Probably the Henderson's son visiting from Boston. Probably. He held the window for another 30 seconds, watching for movement, before he accepted the morning for what it was and moved toward the bathroom. The face in the mirror was 42 years old, which surprised him some mornings more than others. Not because he felt younger. He didn't. Not in his knees or his lower back or the scar tissue that pulled tight along his left forearm when the temperature dropped, but because the face looking back at him had accumulated a kind of weight that he associated with men his father's age. Men who had earned their stillness. He had earned his differently. He shaved with the same methodical economy he applied to everything. Shower. The gray Henley that Nicole had declared embarrassing 3 months ago, and he had continued wearing out of principle. The watch went on last. Scratched military issue, crystal cracked in the upper left corner from an impact in a country he was no longer authorized to discuss, second hand still sweeping clean and true. He checked it against his phone. 5:58. The watch ran 11 seconds fast, the same as always. He had never fixed it. It felt dishonest to fix it. Down the hall, Nicole's door was cracked 2 inches, which was how she slept. He stopped outside it without going in. 12 years old, sprawled across the bed with one arm thrown over her head, dark hair tangled across the star and moon pillowcase she'd chosen herself 3 years ago and refused to replace despite insisting monthly that she was too old for it. Her breathing was the slow, heavy rhythm of genuine sleep, not performance sleep, and he stood there longer than he needed to, just listening to it. 6 years since Denise died. 6 years of this particular calculation, the 2 steps to her door, the pause, the relief that came from hearing her breathe, and it still hit him the same way every morning. Not grief exactly. Not anymore. Something more like gratitude with an edge to it, because gratitude always came with the awareness of what it would cost to lose it. He went downstairs and made coffee the way Denise had taught him. French press, 4 minutes steep, the bloom of grounds rising in the hot water like something alive. He drank it standing at the kitchen window that looked out over the backyard. The workshop was visible from here, a converted garage with new siding he'd put up himself the second winter after she died, when he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't grief. He had a commission in there right now, a dining table for a family in Concord, walnut slab with hand-cut dovetail joints, that was 2 weeks from finished. The work was good, the kind that required enough precision to crowd everything else out. His phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Kenneth Lee. Quiet night. Nothing to report. Marcus typed back with one thumb. Appreciate it. Kenneth had been running periodic drive-bys since last Tuesday, when Marcus had mentioned in passing that he'd noticed a car idling at the end of his block 2 mornings in a row. Kenneth hadn't asked for details. He was a lieutenant with Portsmouth PD, former Marine corporal, the kind of man who understood that some observations didn't need elaboration. Marcus set the phone down and finished his coffee. He was not a man who worried. Worry required uncertainty about outcomes, and Marcus had spent 16 years training himself to move through uncertainty without getting caught in it. But there was something loose in the last week, a frequency he couldn't quite locate, the way a room sometimes felt wrong before you identified the source. He had learned not to dismiss that frequency. At 7:15 he went back upstairs and knocked on Nicole's door. Silence. He knocked again. A sound emerged from inside that was technically a human voice. He pushed the door open. She hadn't moved. 5 more minutes. 5 becomes 10. 10 becomes late. Up. She rolled over and looked at him through sleep-compressed eyes. Her hair was a genuine disaster, and she appeared completely untroubled by this. She had Denise's cheekbones, the same architecture that made strangers look twice, and she was going to be remarkable in ways that Marcus was both proud of and quietly terrified by. "It's Saturday. You have soccer at 9. I hate soccer. You begged me to sign you up. That was a different version of me. I've evolved." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders like a cape. "Can I at least have pancakes? After you're dressed and your teeth are brushed." She threw a pillow at him. He caught it one-handed and set it on the dresser. She was grinning now, the last resistance of sleep dissolving, and that grin was the most purely Denise thing about her. It arrived without warning and lit up the room without trying to. By 8:40 they were in his truck, the old Ford with the transmission that slipped in third gear and 200,000 miles on the engine, and Nicole in the passenger seat with her soccer bag at her feet, earbuds in but volume low. She wasn't really listening to anything. She did that when she was processing something, used the earbuds as a barrier against conversation she wasn't ready for. "You're quiet," Marcus said. She looked out the window. "Emma said something weird yesterday." "Weird how?" "About me. About how I'm different since middle school. Like it was a complaint." Marcus drove. The town moved past the windows, small and settled, the kind of place people chose when they wanted to disappear from wherever they'd been before. He'd chosen it for exactly that reason. No one here knew the specifics of what he'd done overseas, the operations that still surfaced in his dreams 3 or 4 nights a week, clinical and vivid, like training footage. No one here needed to know. Different how? More serious, less fun. She said it like a verdict someone else had handed down, and she was still deciding whether to accept it. "What do you think?" She pulled one earbud out. "I think Emma hasn't had to be the responsible one in her family. I think it's easy to be fun when you don't have to be other things first." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. She was 12 years old, and she understood the architecture of maturity better than some 30-year-olds he'd known. He didn't know if that was something to be proud of or something to feel guilty about. "You can be both," he said. "Can you?" He didn't answer that one. She put the earbud back in. He dropped her at the complex and watched from the truck as she jogged toward the field, soccer bag swinging, ponytail catching the March wind. A few girls called her name. She raised one hand in acknowledgement without breaking stride, absorbed into the group, and then she was just another 12-year-old on a Saturday morning whose biggest concern was whether she'd start or sit the bench. He watched until she was fully on the field and then pulled out of the lot. The Riverside Cafe sat on a corner, red brick and tall windows, the kind of building that had been a hardware store or a dry goods place before someone gutted it and filled it with reclaimed wood and Edison bulbs. It opened at 7 on weekends, and by 8:45 it was half full, the particular Saturday morning mix of laptop workers and people who just wanted somewhere warm to sit with their coffee. Marcus pushed through the door, and the smell hit him immediately. Dark roast, and something baked with cinnamon. And his body did the thing it always did in here, released a degree of tension he'd been carrying without noticing. He scanned the room before he'd taken 3 steps. Corner booth open. 2 exits clearly visible. The older man in the flannel shirt who was here every Saturday with his crossword. The college kid in the back who always had headphones on. 3 women at the center table who were new. A couple by the window whose conversation had the low, tight quality of an argument being managed in public. He moved to the corner booth. Back to the wall, sight lines to the entrance and the full room. It was the only seat in the place he could actually relax in, which Ashley had figured out months ago without being told. She appeared with the coffee pot before he'd finished settling in. Early 20s, art school background she'd mentioned once, the kind of optimism that hadn't yet learned to protect itself. She poured his cup without asking, steam rising between them, and smiled like she meant it. "Usual?" she said. He nodded. She moved on. He wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat work into his palms and sat without his phone, without reading anything, just present in the room in the way that 16 years of operational awareness had made unavoidable, tracking movement and stillness, cataloging without appearing to, the couple's argument reaching some kind of quiet resolution by the window, the crossword man filling in an answer with the nub of a pencil. The door opened at 9:05, and Rebecca Sanchez rolled in. He knew her name because Ashley had used it once, calling across the room to ask if she wanted her regular spot by the outlet. She came most Saturdays around this time, always alone, always with a laptop and what looked like architectural drawings. She was 29, maybe 30, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in clothes that prioritized function. She moved the wheelchair with the efficient economy of someone who had been doing this long enough that it required no conscious thought, navigating the threshold and the floor spacing between tables with small, precise adjustments that spoke to years of practice. She transferred from the chair to the booth with a single smooth motion, folded the wheelchair and tucked it beside the table where it wouldn't block the aisle, and pulled out her laptop and a rolled tube of what looked like design schematics. She uncapped a highlighter and was working before the screen finished loading. Whatever she was doing, she took it seriously. Marcus had never spoken to her. She had never spoken to him. They existed in the same space on Saturday mornings the way regulars did, a nod of mutual acknowledgement that required nothing further. He respected that she was here to work. She appeared to register that he was here to be left alone. It was a functional arrangement. He was halfway through his second cup when the door opened and the temperature in the room changed. Marcus felt it before he identified it. A shift in the room's energy, the particular way ambient noise adjusted when something entered that didn't belong. He looked up. 3 men. The one in front moved with the swagger of someone who had decided long ago that space was a thing other people arranged themselves around. Broad shoulders, leather jacket, late 30s, the kind of face that might have been attractive before whatever had happened to it had carved it into something harder. Behind him, a large man, thick-necked, the build of someone who'd spent serious time lifting, moving with the slow deliberateness of a linebacker 2 steps past his prime. The third was smaller, wiry, eyes doing too much work, the kind of nervous energy that either metabolized or exploded. Marcus's hand tightened around his mug. He didn't move. The man in the leather jacket scanned the room. His eyes moved, the way trained eyes moved, systematic, and when they landed on Marcus, they stopped. Something passed across his face in rapid sequence. Recognition. Then something that wasn't quite surprise, then something that settled into a cold species of satisfaction. He had been looking for Marcus, and he had found him. Marcus knew the face. The intervening 9 years had carved it differently than he remembered, harder, more damaged, the way years of specific kinds of pain carved a person. But he knew it. He had last seen it at a graveside service in Virginia, screaming across a flag-draped casket while security closed in from both sides. He had not forgotten it. Some faces burned themselves into memory whether you wanted them there or not. Timothy Clark, Owen's younger brother. Owen, who had held the rear position in a valley in a country Marcus was not going to think about right now, who had refused a direct order to fall back, who had bought 8 men the 3 minutes they needed to reach the extraction point. Owen, who had known exactly what he was doing and had done it anyway, which was the kind of man he had been, which was the kind of man who made those choices look simple, even when they were the hardest calculation of anyone's life. Timothy had showed up at the funeral drunk and shaking, and he had called Marcus a murderer in front of 200 people before security got to him. That had been the last time. 9 years ago. And now he was standing in the Riverside Cafe on a Saturday morning in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and the particular quality of the satisfaction on his face made it clear that this was not coincidence. He didn't come at Marcus directly. That was the first thing Marcus registered, and it told him something important about how much had changed and how much hadn't. Timothy had always been the smarter of the 2 Clark boys in certain ways, more strategic, less purely physical. He moved toward Rebecca's table instead, a deliberate redirect, and Marcus understood in the span of a breath what was happening. This was a maneuver. Timothy wanted Marcus to stand up. He wanted the room to see Marcus stand up. He was engineering a situation that would require Marcus to reveal himself before he was ready. Timothy stopped at Rebecca's table. She was focused on her screen, fingers moving across the keyboard, 100% absorbed. She registered his presence a half-second late, looked up, and Marcus watched the moment her expression shifted, from mild annoyance at the interruption to something more careful, the particular blankness that people learn to wear when they understand that the situation is going to escalate regardless of what they do. Timothy gestured at the booth around her. "You're taking up a lot of space here." His voice was loud enough to carry, not shouting, performing. "Four-person table, just you, seems a little selfish." Rebecca's voice stayed level. "There are other tables available. I like this one. Then you'll enjoy it when I leave." Timothy's hand came down on the table, not a fist, a flat palm, driving hard into the surface, sudden enough that Rebecca's coffee jumped and sloshed across the laminate in a dark spreading stain that reached the edge of her laptop. She pulled back, hands up, her chair rolling 2 inches before it hit the wall. The cafe had gone completely silent. Marcus set his mug down and stood up. Every eye in the room swung toward him. Timothy's gaze swung toward him. And in that instant Marcus saw it happen. The performance mask Timothy had been wearing cracked just enough to show what was underneath, which was not anger or hatred, but something closer to relief. He had been looking for this exact moment. He had arranged the entire approach to produce it. There he is. Timothy spread his arms slightly, a gesture that managed to be simultaneously welcoming and threatening. "Been looking for you, Marcus." Marcus walked toward him. Not fast, not slow, the measured pace of someone who had identified the tripwire and was choosing how to approach it. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to act, far enough to give the room, and Timothy, the perception of a choice still available. Walk away. Quiet, each word deliberate. Timothy blinked. He had expected something else. Anger, aggression, the reaction he could feed on. The absolute absence of it threw him for a beat. He recovered. "Or what? You going to restrain me again? Make another one of your famous executive decisions? I'm asking you to leave her alone." Asking. Timothy tasted the word. That's polite. Very polite. Very different from the guy who left my brother to die on a hillside in the dark. The cafe held its breath. Marcus held his expression. The words landed where they were designed to land, in the place where the weight actually lived, the place that was never fully quiet, but he had spent 9 years learning to absorb that particular impact without showing it, and he absorbed it now. "This isn't about Owen," Marcus said. "This is about you deciding to start something." "Maybe I am." Timothy stepped closer, chest to chest now, close enough that Marcus could smell the whiskey underneath the coffee and morning air. Not drunk, pre-loaded. The kind of drinking that was preparation rather than recreation. "You got a problem with that?" Marcus didn't step back. He didn't square up. He simply stood, weight-centered, hands loose at his sides, and waited with the specific patience of someone who understood exactly how this would end if it went wrong and was not afraid of that knowledge. "Walk away," Marcus said. "Last time." Timothy shoved him, heel of the palm, hard into the shoulder joint, testing the boundary, begging for escalation. Marcus's body rocked back an inch and settled. He didn't grab Timothy's wrist, didn't shove back, just stood. Behind the counter, Ashley had her phone pressed to her ear, lips moving. The second shove came harder, both hands against Marcus's chest, Timothy putting his weight behind it, trying to drive him backward into the wall. Marcus moved with it instead of against it, taking 2 controlled steps back, using the momentum to create distance rather than resistance. His spine touched brick. He stopped. Timothy came forward. "Come on." Timothy's voice cracked at the edges, something raw bleeding through the performance. "Do something. I know you want to." Marcus didn't want to. That was the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of everything Timothy had arranged this morning. He had built the entire approach on the assumption that Marcus could be provoked into becoming something he'd worked 6 years not to be. Marcus had nothing to prove here. No ego investment in dominance, no face to save, no audience he needed to perform for. He had buried enough of his capacity for violence in the same ground where he'd buried the life that required it. But Dalton was committed now, too far in to back out, with his friends watching, with the cafe watching, with whatever small remaining piece of his pride demanded he see this through. He threw the punch, wide, looping hook, telegraphed from a mile out, the mechanics of someone who'd learned to fight from bar brawls rather than men who understood it as a discipline with grammar and consequence. Marcus saw it coming with what felt like time to spare. He shifted his weight to his left foot, turned his shoulder, slipped inside the arc as the punch moved through the space where his head had been a heartbeat before. His left hand came up and caught Timothy's extended wrist, fingers wrapping around bone and tendon. His right hand found Timothy's elbow, thumb pressing into the nerve cluster at the joint's interior with exactly calibrated pressure. Basic control hold, the kind that worked because it respected anatomy rather than trying to override it. Marcus rotated the arm, not hard, not fast, following the natural range of motion until resistance became compliance. Timothy's body followed because it had no choice. 3 seconds. Timothy was facing the wall, right arm pinned behind him at an angle that made movement an equation with only one solution, and Marcus stood behind him, controlling the position with micro-adjustments that looked effortless. "Stop moving." Almost gentle. "You're going to hurt yourself." The cafe had gone so quiet that Marcus could hear the crossword man's pencil set down against his saucer. Timothy struggled for 15 seconds, muscles testing the hold from every angle, finding no give in any of them. Then the fight drained out of him the way it always drained out eventually, all at once, muscles releasing, breathing going ragged. Marcus held the position for 3 more seconds, then released and stepped back, giving Timothy space and an exit simultaneously. Timothy turned around slowly. His face was flushed, eyes wide. He looked at Marcus the way people looked at something they had fundamentally misjudged. His mouth opened and closed without producing words. Sirens outside. 2 cruisers pulling up, lights painting the cafe windows blue and red. 4 officers through the door, the first one young, blonde, hand on her radio. The second one older, gray at the temples, a face that had fielded too many Saturday morning calls, name tag reading Lee. Kenneth Lee moved through the room differently than his partner, slower and more deliberate, and his eyes found Marcus first and stayed there. He said something quiet to the younger officer. She moved toward Timothy. Kenneth walked toward Marcus and stopped at a distance that was professional and also, in some register that didn't need to be named, collegial. "Tell me what happened." Marcus met his eyes directly and didn't rush anything. "He knocked over her table, deliberately." He gestured toward Rebecca, still in her booth, laptop open to a screen showing what looked like a playground rendering, coffee stain drying at the edge. Then he took a swing. Kenneth looked at the table, looked at the stain, looked at Marcus's face, and then briefly, with the specificity of someone reading a document, at the watch on Marcus's left wrist. Military issue. The scratched crystal. The kind of timepiece you didn't buy. "And what did you do?" "Restrained him. Didn't hit him." Kenneth looked over his shoulder. His partner had Timothy against the far wall, taking his ID, Timothy cooperating with the hollow compliance of someone whose engine had finally run out of fuel. The older man from the crossword table had gotten to his feet and was walking over, and Ashley was still behind the counter, phone in hand, and between the two of them they told Kenneth exactly what had happened and in what order, which was the truth, which was all Marcus needed. Kenneth looked at Marcus again, the full assessment. The way he stood, the way his eyes tracked movement without his head moving, the economy of everything he did. Ex-military? It wasn't really a question. Marcus nodded once. "What branch?" "Navy." "How long?" 16 years. Kenneth waited. When Marcus didn't offer more, he didn't push. He nodded once, the nod of a man who had gotten the answer he was looking for, and turned and gave his partner a small signal. She started walking Timothy toward the door. Timothy looked back at Marcus one time. His expression had moved through fear and embarrassment and arrived somewhere more complicated, Not respect exactly, but the rearrangement that happens when a fundamental assumption about the world turns out to be wrong. He didn't say anything. He walked out. Kenneth turned back. "You want to press charges?" Marcus shook his head. "File a report? We've got witnesses, probably video." A glance toward the college kid in the corner who had definitely been recording something. "I just want to go home." Kenneth studied him for a moment, then pulled a card from his breast pocket and held it out. "He comes back around. You call me." Marcus took it. Kenneth extended his hand. The grip was firm, the handshake of two men who understood certain things about each other without needing to discuss them. Kenneth said quietly, "Thank you for your service." Then, louder, addressing the room, "Anyone who recorded this, I need you to delete it. This is not content. Someone could have been seriously hurt." He watched the college kid tap his screen and hold it up, nodded, walked out. The cafe exhaled. Conversation resumed, carefully at first, people finding their way back to their Saturday mornings with the particular tentativeness of people who have witnessed something they didn't expect. Ashley came out from behind the counter with a towel and handed it to Marcus without saying anything. He wiped the coffee off his jeans where the table had jostled during the confrontation and dropped the towel on the booth seat. He walked to the counter. Ashley was behind it now, steadier than before. "How much for the coffee?" She shook her head. "On the house. I'd rather pay." She looked at him for a moment, really looked, and then understood. She rang it up. $3.50. He gave her a $5, told her to keep it, and she said quietly, "Thank you for not making it worse." He nodded and turned toward the door. The crossword man caught his eye as he passed. He raised his coffee cup slightly, a small formal gesture between strangers. Marcus returned it with a nod and kept walking. Outside, the air was cold and clean, March not yet convinced it was spring. He walked to his truck and sat behind the wheel and looked through the windshield at the cafe where people were settling back into their lives, and for a moment it felt like something had resolved. The cruisers were gone. Timothy was gone. The moment had passed. Then Kenneth appeared at the passenger window, knocking twice. Marcus rolled it down. Kenneth leaned against the doorframe, voice low and careful. "Timothy Clark walked into the station 3 days ago. Asked by name whether you still lived in Portsmouth, your address, your general schedule." He paused. "We didn't think much of it until this morning. He just got out of county 2 weeks ago. Assault with a deadly weapon. 5 years served. And Marcus," he paused again, choosing the next words with the care of a man who understood what they would do. "Before you ask, no, I don't think this was random." Marcus held his eyes steady. "What do you know about him?" "Former Marine, 6 years. General discharge after his brother's death in service. Priors for disorderly conduct, DUI, a domestic complaint that didn't stick. The assault charge was a bar situation, broken bottle, severed an artery. 3 witnesses said he started it. Jury agreed. Judge gave him 7, served 5 for behavior." Kenneth straightened. "Whatever history you two have, it didn't end this morning." Marcus started the engine. "I know." "Drive careful," Kenneth said and stepped back from the window. Marcus pulled out of the lot and headed toward the soccer complex. He drove through the town he had chosen for its smallness and its distance from his former life, past the hardware store where he bought lumber and screws, past the elementary school where Nicole had learned to read, past the cemetery where Denise was buried under a granite headstone she would have considered perfectly adequate, and not a word more. He didn't stop at the cemetery today. He thought about Owen Clark the way he thought about him every month. Not with guilt, not exactly, because guilt required a belief that the choice had been wrong, and Marcus had made his peace with the choice in the way that was possible for a person who had been in command and understood what being in command meant. 1 life weighed against 8. The math was brutal, and it was correct, and Owen had understood it before Marcus did, which was why Owen had refused the order to fall back and held his position and given 8 men the minutes they needed. Owen had made a choice. Marcus had accepted it. Both of them had lived with what that meant, in whatever ways people lived with things. Timothy had not made his peace. Marcus understood that too. The soccer complex was organized chaos when he arrived, games ending and starting, parents with folding chairs, the particular energy of Saturday morning youth sports that was somehow exhausting to observe. He spotted Nicole on the far sideline talking to Emma Rodriguez, her best friend since second grade. Nicole saw the truck and waved, that wide, unself-conscious wave she hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by, and jogged over. She climbed in slightly out of breath, face flushed, hair half escaped from its ponytail. "We won 3-2. I got an assist. That's my girl." She grinned and pulled her seatbelt across. "Can we get pizza? We have leftovers." "Pizza is better than leftovers." "Pizza is expensive." "You're such a dad." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the team group chat, reading him selected highlights of the game with the editorial confidence of someone who had been there and could verify the record. He was halfway home when his phone buzzed in the cup holder. He glanced at it at a red light. Unknown number. The text read, "There he is. Been a long time, Marcus. We should catch up properly." He set the phone face down without responding. Nicole looked up from her own screen. "Everything okay?" "Fine." She watched him the way she watched him when she knew he was managing something, reading the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his hands on the wheel. She had her mother's perceptiveness, which had been one of Denise's great gifts and was presently a complicated inheritance. "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "What?" "The thing where you look at everything the same amount, so nothing looks different." He said nothing. She went back to her phone, but the scrolling slowed and then stopped, and she was looking out the window for the rest of the drive. At home, he made her a sandwich she hadn't asked for and watched her eat it at the kitchen table while he stood at the window with his coffee, watching the street. Nothing on the street. A neighbor walking a retriever. A kid on a bike. The ordinary, unremarkable geometry of a Saturday afternoon in a small New Hampshire town that was supposed to be far enough from everything that what had happened this morning couldn't follow him here. His phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. "Nice reflexes, by the way. Owen taught me that grip. He learned it from you. Funny how that works." Marcus set the phone on the counter face down. Nicole was watching him from the table. "Dad?" "It's nothing." She looked at him with the expression that meant she had already calculated what kind of nothing it was and had filed her assessment. She finished her sandwich and took her plate to the sink and went upstairs without being asked to, which was its own kind of message. He called Kenneth from the back porch with the door closed. "He's texting me. Different number." Kenneth was quiet for a moment. "What's he saying?" "Enough. He knows about my training background. He mentioned Owen specifically." Marcus kept his voice level. "He's not done." "No," Kenneth said. "He's not. I'm going to run his known associates, see who he's been in contact with since release. In the meantime," a pause, "keep Nicole close." Marcus looked out at the workshop, the clean lines of the siding he'd put up board by board through the worst winter of his life. Beyond it, the fence line, the gate latch he'd replaced last fall, the sight lines from the street that he hadn't thought about in years and was thinking about now. "I'll be in touch," he said, and ended the call. He stood on the back porch for a long time after, watching the yard go quiet as the afternoon settled. The swing set he'd built when Nicole was 4 stood at the far corner, rusted now and unused, the evidence of a childhood moving past the phases he'd been present for. He'd been present for all of them. That was the thing he had traded 16 years of service for, the right to be present for all of it. He was not going to let that trade be unmade. He went inside, locked both doors, and went upstairs to check on his daughter. She was at her desk doing homework, pencil between her teeth, frowning at something in her math textbook. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. She looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, like she was reading a document and deciding how much of what she understood to say out loud. "You're going to tell me everything is fine," she said. "I'm handling something." "Is it the man from this morning?" He was quiet for one beat too long, and she read it. "I figured," she said. She turned back to her textbook. Then, without looking up, "Don't lie to me, Dad. Mom made you promise not to lie to me." He leaned against the doorframe. "There's someone who's angry about something that happened a long time ago, before you were old enough to know about it. I'm handling it." She turned a page she probably hadn't finished reading. "Okay? Okay? I trust you," she said simply, in the tone of someone who had thought about it carefully before arriving at the conclusion. "Just don't make me regret it." He went back downstairs. He sat in the kitchen and waited for his phone to buzz again, and when it did, 20 minutes later, he read the message without picking the phone up. "Pretty busy Saturday for a man just trying to live a quiet life. Wonder what Monday looks like, or Tuesday, or any morning your daughter walks to that bus stop." He picked the phone up then. He read the message twice. He set it face down on the table and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. He had known, pulling out of the cafe parking lot, that the morning hadn't resolved anything. Kenneth had confirmed it. The texts had confirmed it. But there was a difference between knowing something abstractly and having it written down in front of you. Specific, operational, the language of someone who had done his homework and was ready to move from reconnaissance to action. Timothy Clark was not a man having an episode. He was a man executing a plan, which meant Marcus needed one too. He got up and went to the back porch and stood in the cold evening air and began quietly and methodically to think. Sunday passed the way Sundays did when Marcus was running threat assessment in the background of everything, outwardly ordinary, internally operational. He took Nicole to the hardware store in the morning and let her spend 40 minutes choosing paint samples for her bedroom, a project she'd been lobbying for since January. She held swatches against her forearm, against the store's fluorescent lighting, against a patch of natural light near the entrance, applying the same methodical seriousness to the selection that she applied to most things. She chose a blue that sat somewhere between the ocean off the Virginia coast and the sky over Portsmouth on a clear February morning. Marcus bought 2 gallons and the supplies and drove them home. They spent the afternoon taping trim and rolling primer, working in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over 6 years of learning each other's rhythms. Nicole's phone played music through the small speaker on her dresser, something with a slow beat that Marcus didn't recognize and didn't ask about. By 4 o'clock the first coat was drying and Nicole was on the couch downstairs wrapped in a blanket watching a movie, and Marcus was in the chair by the front window with a book he hadn't read a sentence of, watching the street. No unfamiliar vehicles. No one parked too long in one place. Nothing. He checked his phone twice. No new messages from the unknown number. Kenneth had sent a brief text at noon, running down his associates. Nothing actionable yet. Marcus had responded with a single word and gone back to watching the street. The absence of contact was not reassuring. It was information of a different kind. Monday arrived cold and overcast. The sky the specific gray of New Hampshire in the final weeks before spring committed to anything. Marcus drove Nicole to school and sat in the parking lot until the bell rang and the last student disappeared through the main entrance, and he scanned every vehicle in the lot twice before pulling out. He drove home through the back way, the longer route that took him past the cemetery. He didn't stop. He slowed without meaning to, the truck dropping to 15 miles per hour as the granite markers moved past the window, and then he accelerated again and drove home. In the workshop, he tried to work on the walnut table. The commission had a 2-week deadline that had been easy to meet before Saturday morning, and now the precision the work required was running directly into the frequency his mind wouldn't stop broadcasting. He measured a section of the apron 3 times and got 3 marginally different numbers, which meant he was introducing error through inconsistency in his hand pressure, which meant his focus was elsewhere. He put the measuring tape down and stood at the workbench for a moment with his palms flat on the surface, looking at the wood grain without seeing it. Then he went for a run. He pushed hard from the first block, harder than he needed to, the kind of pace that made conversation impossible, and left no bandwidth for anything that wasn't mechanics. Foot strike, breathing, the burn building in his quads on the long hill that ran parallel to the river. He ran 5 miles and came back drenched and breathing through his mouth and stood on the front porch cooling down, and the frequency was still there, quieter now but not gone. His phone rang while he was stretching. Unknown number. He answered without speaking. Silence on the other end. Then Timothy's voice, unhurried, almost conversational. Ignoring texts is one thing. Not picking up starts to feel personal. Marcus said nothing. I just want to talk. Is that so unreasonable? Old acquaintances catching up? A pause. I've been thinking about you a lot, Marcus. Had a lot of time to think. 5 years is a long time. You learn things about yourself in a cell that you can't learn anywhere else. Marcus ended the call and blocked the number. 30 seconds later, a different number. He let it ring through to voicemail. 10 minutes after that, another call, another number. Then another. 6 different numbers across the next hour. None of them leaving messages. The pattern of someone who understood that the calls themselves were the message. I have resources, I have time, and I am not going away. At 2:30, Marcus drove to Nicole's school and parked across from the main entrance. He was 45 minutes early. He sat with the engine off and watched every vehicle that turned onto the block. At 3:12, a truck he didn't recognize rolled past the school at 5 miles per hour. Dark blue, older model, the kind of vehicle that was anonymous by design. Behind the wheel, visible through the glass as the truck moved through the patch of afternoon light between 2 parked cars, Timothy Clark, window down, his left arm resting on the doorframe, easy, unhurried, like a man taking a leisurely afternoon drive through a neighborhood that happened to contain an elementary school. He saw Marcus. He raised one hand in a loose wave, the gesture of someone acknowledging a neighbor, and kept driving. Turned the corner and didn't come back. Marcus sat with his hands on the wheel and breathed through it. The bell rang at 3:15. Kids came out in the cascading wave of released energy that characterized the end of every school day, and Nicole emerged in the middle of it, backpack over one shoulder, talking to Emma with the full-body expressiveness of someone working through a genuine grievance about something that had happened in 4th period. She spotted the truck and waved and said something to Emma and jogged over. She climbed in and launched immediately into the science project partner situation, which had apparently deteriorated further. Marcus listened with most of his attention, the rest of it on the rearview mirror, watching the corner where Timothy's truck had disappeared. He drove home the back way again and said nothing about what he'd seen. That evening Kenneth called. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was relaying information he wished he didn't have. Got a call this afternoon. Rebecca Sanchez. She wanted to know if there was any update on the cafe situation. Said something happened to her ramp. Marcus felt the back of his neck go cold. What kind of something? 3 support brackets, snapped clean through. Her landlord's looking at 2 days minimum before he can get someone in to fix it. She's stuck on the 2nd floor until then. A pause. She mentioned you specifically, said you'd stepped in for her on Saturday, wanted to know if she should be concerned. She should be concerned. Marcus kept his voice flat. This is Timothy making a point. He can't reach me directly, so he's reaching adjacent. That's a reach, Marcus. He texts me about Nicole's bus stop, and 48 hours later, the ramp of the woman I defended gets destroyed. That's not reach. That's sequence. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. Even if you're right, proving it is a different problem entirely. The ramp is on the side of the building with no camera coverage, no witnesses. I can't move on him with what I have. So what can you do? Increase patrols around her building, around yours. Have a conversation with him if I can locate him. His last known address is already dead. Landlord says he cleared out 2 weeks ago without leaving a forwarding. Kenneth exhaled, the sound of a man pressing against the limits of what his tools could accomplish. Marcus, off the record, if you have somewhere you can send Nicole for a few days, somewhere out of the picture, it might be worth considering. Marcus thanked him and ended the call. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the backyard go dark as evening arrived, the workshop lights throwing yellow rectangles across the dead grass, and he thought about what it meant that Timothy had already moved on Rebecca. Not because she mattered to Timothy, because she mattered, or appeared to matter, to Marcus, which meant Timothy had been watching Saturday's cafe scene not just as confrontation, but as reconnaissance, cataloging who Marcus moved to protect, identifying the adjacent targets, building a map of leverage. It was exactly the approach Marcus would have taken. The recognition was unpleasant. Tuesday morning he drove to Rebecca's apartment building on the east side, a converted Victorian with second-floor access via an exterior ramp that now hung at a damaged angle. 2 of 3 support brackets snapped cleanly, the third bent at a degree that suggested deliberate force applied at exactly the right point. Not vandalism. Engineering. Someone who understood load distribution had done this. He knocked, heard movement inside. Rebecca's voice came through the door. "Who is it?" "Marcus Johnson, from the cafe." A pause. Locks turning. The door opened and she was in the frame, dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there Saturday, hair loose rather than pulled back. She looked at him the way people looked at someone they were deciding how much to trust, running the calculation openly rather than hiding it. "I heard about the ramp," Marcus said. "I can fix it." She studied him for another moment. "You think he did it?" "Yes. Because of Saturday. Because he's building toward something and he wants me to understand the radius of what he's capable of reaching." He said it plainly, without dressing it up, because she had the particular intelligence of someone who responded better to accuracy than to management. She wheeled back and let him in. The apartment was small and organized with the precision of someone who had spent years calibrating their environment to function exactly as needed. Everything at the right height, pathways clear, the kitchen arranged so that countertop workspace flowed without interruption. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table surrounded by the same architectural drawings he'd seen at the cafe, the playground project, and beside them a printed email with the header of a grant organization. Marcus set his tools down and started assessing what the ramp repair would need. Rebecca made coffee without asking if he wanted any and set a mug on the table within his reach and went back to her drawings. They worked in parallel for a few minutes, him measuring and noting, her marking something in the margin of a design sheet with a red pen. Then she looked up from the drawings. "He came here last night." Marcus went still. "Knocked around 10, didn't give a name. Talked through the door for about 5 minutes. Said you'd caused a lot of trouble. Said people who aligned themselves with you tended to regret it." She said it without drama, reporting rather than confiding. "I didn't open the door. I called the police after he left. They came, took a statement, told me the same thing your officer friend probably told you. That without proof of intent they can't act. That without proof of intent they can't act." She picked up her coffee. "I know what that sentence means. I've heard it before." He waited. 3 years ago I was on a job site, inspecting work for a client, commercial build in Manchester. Someone had loosened the railing bolts on a scaffold section on the 3rd level. She said it in the tone of someone who had told this story enough times to have stripped it down to its structural load. "I went over, 20 feet onto concrete, 3 vertebrae." She set the mug down. "The investigation found evidence of interference but couldn't establish who. My business partner at the firm took my clients, my projects, and my office before I was out of the ICU. By the time I had enough function to fight it, he was in California and the case had gone cold." Marcus looked at her. "You know it was him." "I know it was him. Knowing and proving are different countries, and I don't have a passport for the second one." She looked back at her drawings. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I'm not new to the situation. I've already lived through the version where the system can't move fast enough. I'm not going to sit in this apartment and wait to find out what happens when someone decides I'm a soft target twice." It was the most she'd said at one time. She went back to her drawings after she said it, the way people did when they'd shared exactly as much as they intended to, and the conversation had reached its limit. Marcus went outside and fixed the ramp. He drove to the hardware store 2 miles away and bought industrial-grade brackets, the kind that required power tools to remove, and spent 3 hours rebuilding the structure from the mounting points out. He over-engineered it deliberately. The ramp that existed after he was done was stronger than the original had been before Timothy touched it. He tested every board and every joint before he packed his tools. Rebecca wheeled down and back up, testing the stability. It didn't flex. She looked at it for a moment. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This might just make him angrier." She looked at him with the directness that he'd noticed at the cafe, the absence of any instinct to soften things for social comfort. "Then we'll deal with that too." She paused. "Whatever you're planning, and I can see that you're planning something, don't let him turn you into a version of yourself you'd have to explain to your daughter." He gave her his number before he left and told her to call if anything changed, and she nodded once, the nod of someone who would and who also understood that calling wasn't the same as asking for rescue. He drove home thinking about what she'd said, about the line between responding and becoming, about whether there was a version of this that didn't require him to reach back into the part of himself he'd been systematically retiring for 6 years. His phone buzzed. A new unknown number. "Nice carpentry work. You always were good with your hands. Shame you couldn't use them to save Owen." He deleted it without responding. The message had been sent while he was working, which meant Timothy either had eyes on Rebecca's building or had someone who did. The radius of surveillance was wider than Marcus had calculated. He noted the adjustment and drove home. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a rhythm of enforced normalcy that cost him more than it should have. He drove Nicole to school, watched her go in, drove home, attempted the walnut table with mixed results, drove back at pickup and scanned every vehicle on the block before pulling in. Nicole moved through the days with the deliberate not-asking quality that meant she was watching him carefully and choosing not to put pressure on whatever was already there. She was doing her homework and talking to Emma on the phone and complaining about fractions and eating everything he put in front of her without comment, which was a level of compliance that told him she understood the situation was serious even without the details. Thursday afternoon, Kenneth called again. "Timothy filed a harassment complaint against you this morning. His lawyer is making noise about a restraining order claiming you've been following him, intimidating him." The sound Marcus made was not quite a laugh. "That's insane." "I know it is, but he's got a lawyer, which means he's got resources from somewhere, and the lawyer is smart enough to understand that paperwork creates narrative. If this escalates to anything legal, the first thing a judge sees is his complaint on file, dated before whatever comes next." Marcus sat down at the kitchen table. "He's building a story where I'm the aggressor. He's building a story where he's the victim, which is the same thing from a different angle. I need you to stay completely clear of him, Marcus. Don't respond to the numbers. Don't drive past anywhere you think he might be. If he makes contact, you document it and you call me. That's it. And in the meantime, I'm working the case I have, which is harassment and property damage with no direct evidence linking him to either. I'm not telling you to do nothing. I'm telling you to let me do what I can do with the tools I have." Marcus thanked him and sat at the kitchen table after the call ended, not moving, thinking about the geometry of it. Timothy had been out of prison for 2 weeks and in that time had made himself both the threat and, on paper, the complainant. He'd identified Marcus's adjacent targets. He'd established surveillance. He was patient and strategic in ways that his behavior at the cafe hadn't fully telegraphed. The cafe had been a performance, a provocation to establish contact, but everything after was operational. That evening, Nicole came downstairs to find Marcus standing at the kitchen window again, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said. He turned. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed, 12 years old, wearing the expression of someone who had been running a calculation for several days and had arrived at a conclusion. "Emma's been asking why I haven't been coming over after school. I've been saying you need help with the house stuff. She's starting to think something's wrong." A pause. "Something is wrong. I'm handling it." "You keep saying that." She wasn't angry, just precise, the way she got when she was insisting on accuracy. "I know you are. I can see that you are. I just want to know when I'm allowed to stop pretending everything's normal." He looked at her for a long moment. "A few more days." She nodded. "Okay." She turned to go back upstairs and then stopped. "Dad, whatever this is about, you're not wrong." She said it simply, without elaboration, the way she sometimes said things that she'd thought through completely and was confident in, and went upstairs. He stood in the kitchen for a while after that. Friday morning he found the envelope. He had come downstairs at 5:45, slightly later than usual because he'd slept poorly and had finally, around 4, dropped into the deep sleep that only came when the body overrode the mind's objections. He made coffee and unlocked the back door to check the workshop, and on his way back through the front hall he saw it, a white envelope on the doormat inside the mail slot. No stamp, no return address, just his name in block letters printed with a black marker. He opened it at the kitchen table without sitting down. Inside, a single photograph, 4x6, printed on standard photo paper. Nicole and Emma outside the school entrance, taken from across the street. The angle was consistent with a telephoto lens operated from inside a vehicle. Timestamp in the lower right corner. Yesterday, Wednesday, 3:18 p.m. Nicole was wearing the blue jacket she'd had on when he picked her up. Her face was circled in red marker, a clean, careful circle, the kind you drew with intention. Across the bottom, in the same block print as the envelope, "Pretty girl. Shame if something happened." The photograph was in his fist before he'd made the conscious decision to close his hand. He forced himself to set it flat on the table and step back and breathe. The tactical part of his mind was already running. Timothy had been outside the school Wednesday at 3:18 with a telephoto lens, which meant he'd been close enough to do significantly more than take a photograph, which meant the photograph was a message rather than the action itself, which meant Timothy was still in the communication phase rather than the execution phase, which meant Marcus still had time. He called Kenneth at 6:10. Voicemail. He left a message that came out controlled but tight. "Timothy left a photograph of Nicole in my door slot overnight. Her face is circled in red marker. Explicit written threat. I need you to pick him up." He called the school next, asked for the principal, a woman named Hutchins who had been patient and kind in the months after Denise died when Nicole was 7 and adjusting badly. He explained the situation in the broadest terms that still conveyed the necessity, asked if they could keep Nicole inside during unstructured outdoor time, asked that no one release her to anyone but Marcus himself. Hutchins agreed immediately and promised to brief staff and suggested a restraining order. He thanked her and didn't tell her that a restraining order was paper, and paper had no physical properties that would stop a man who had already decided consequences were theoretical. Kenneth called back at 6:50, his voice carrying the specific weight of someone absorbing information they'd hoped not to receive. "I sent officers to his last known contact address. He's not there. Different location than the landlord's address, a motel out on Route 1 where he'd been paying week to week. Checked out yesterday morning. He's mobile, Marcus, could be anywhere in the area." "He's not far." The certainty in Marcus's own voice surprised him slightly. "He's not done. He doesn't go far when he's not done." "I know. We're looking. In the meantime—" Kenneth paused, clearly making a decision about something. "The restraining order idea isn't wrong, even if it's incomplete. It creates a legal record. It gives us more tools if he surfaces and makes contact. File it. And Kenneth, Nicole can't stay here while he's loose and I don't know where he is." Silence on the line for a beat. "You have somewhere you can send her?" "Vermont. Her aunt's farm." "Do it." The directness of it, from a man who had been carefully navigating the boundaries of what he could officially advise, told Marcus more than the words themselves. "Do it today." Marcus went upstairs and stood in Nicole's doorway. She was already awake, sitting on her bed with her knees pulled up, phone in her lap. She'd heard his early calls. The walls in the old house were not thick. She looked at him with the calm of someone who had been preparing themselves for the next thing. "How long?" she asked, the same question she'd asked before. "Few days, maybe a week." He sat on the edge of the bed. "There's someone I need to deal with, and I need to know you're somewhere he can't reach while I deal with it." She nodded slowly. She didn't ask who or why or any of the questions she could have asked, the ones she was certainly carrying. "Aunt Sandra's?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to be okay?" "I'm going to handle it." She looked at him with Denise's eyes, the same particular quality of attention, the kind that didn't let you off the hook with indirection. "That's not what I asked." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm going to do everything I can to come back to you in one piece. That's the only promise that means anything." She sat with that. Then she got up and started packing, pulling clothes from the closet with quiet efficiency, and he stood in the doorway watching her and thought about all the ways a person could be broken by the things that happened to them, and all the ways they could choose not to be, and how the choice had to be made over and over, every day, without any guarantee that the outcome justified it. She packed in 20 minutes. They loaded her bag into the truck in the cold Friday morning before school, and Marcus told the school she'd be out for several days and drove north on 89 through fog that reduced visibility to the length of 2 car hoods. Sandra Anderson met them at the door of the farmhouse in Vermont with coffee and the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had loved Denise for her whole life and had extended that love to the family Denise had made. She pulled Nicole into a hug that Nicole returned fully, without the self-consciousness she usually brought to physical affection, and Marcus stood on the porch and felt the farm's particular quiet close around them. No traffic sounds, no ambient city noise, just wind and the distant sound of the horses in the paddock. He stayed for lunch. He helped Nicole carry her bag to the guest room. He walked the property once, not because he needed to assess it, but because the movement helped. When he left in the early afternoon, Nicole walked him to the truck. She looked up at him in the gray Vermont light. "Don't do anything that makes you someone I don't recognize when you come back." He drove south for 2 hours through clearing fog, the road gradually acquiring the familiar geometry of Portsmouth, and he thought about what she'd said, about recognition, about the gap between who he had been trained to be and who he had spent 6 years becoming, and whether those two things could coexist in the same body when the situation demanded both. He was still thinking about it when he walked into his empty house and stood in the kitchen in the silence, and his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered on the second ring. Timothy's voice came through the speaker without preamble, without the performance quality it had carried at the cafe. Just direct, almost businesslike, with an undercurrent that Marcus had not heard in it before, something stripped down, something that sounded like a man who had run out of a particular kind of energy and was operating on what remained underneath. "Porter Street Warehouse, tonight, 9 p.m. Come alone." A pause. "You don't show. I drive to Vermont." Marcus said, "Why?" "Because I've got 6 months." Timothy said it the way you said a number you'd looked at long enough that it had stopped being shocking. "Maybe less. It's my liver. I've been drinking since Owen died, and it turns out that has consequences, which is funny because consequences were supposed to be your department." A short silence. "I'm not going to die with this unfinished. So come tonight. Just you. We end this like men, not lawyers. 9 o'clock. The call ended. Marcus stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand. The house was completely silent around him. He looked at the refrigerator covered in Nicole's drawings, stick figures with big heads, a dog they'd never owned, a family portrait that Denise had kept on the fridge until the last week of her life, and that Marcus had never been able to take down. He looked at the coffee mug still sitting on the counter from this morning. He looked at the watch on his wrist, the cracked crystal, the second hand sweeping its reliable arc, 6 months, maybe less. Maybe a dying man had just given him a location and a time, a dying man who had nothing left to protect, no family waiting, no future worth negotiating toward, nothing that required him to calculate risk the way living people calculated risk. That was the variable that changed everything. That was the thing no training manual accounted for completely, because training assumed adversaries who wanted to survive the encounter. Marcus set the phone on the counter. He went to the back porch and stood in the cold air and gave himself 5 minutes to simply think without moving toward any conclusion. Then he went inside and called Kenneth. "He just called me," Marcus said. "Porter Street warehouse. Tonight at 9. Alone." He said it straight, no editorializing. "He also told me he has 6 months to live. Liver failure." Kenneth was quiet for a moment that held a great deal of weight. "That explains the escalation pattern. It explains all of it." "Marcus," Kenneth's voice shifted into something careful and deliberate, "you are not going to that warehouse alone." "I know." "Tell me you mean that." "I mean it." Marcus looked at the workshop through the kitchen window, the clean lines of the thing he'd built with his hands in the worst winter of his life. "But I am going. We need to talk." Marcus called Kenneth back within 2 minutes of ending Timothy's call, and the conversation that followed was short because neither of them needed it to be long. Kenneth listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished laying out what he was proposing, Kenneth was quiet for 4 seconds. Marcus counted them, and then said, "I'll be inside 30 minutes before you. You come in through the loading dock east side. I'll take the north entrance. Pamela Scott covers the exterior and the vehicle approaches." Another pause. "And Marcus, you carry nothing tonight that you wouldn't want a prosecutor to see." Marcus looked at the garage door for a moment. "Understood." He called Rebecca next. She picked up on the second ring, her voice alert in the way of someone who hadn't been sleeping easily either. He told her the shape of the plan without the operational details, that tonight was likely the end of it, that Kenneth was involved, that there was one thing she could do that would matter significantly if she was willing. Her answer came without hesitation. "Tell me what you need." He explained. She listened. When he finished, she said, "I can do that. I'll be home all evening, lights on, everything normal. What time should I expect the officer?" 7:30 at the latest. Her name is Pamela Scott." "All right." A brief pause, the kind that held something unsaid. "Marcus, whatever happens in that building tonight, come back from it being who you are, not who he needs you to be." He held that for a moment after the call ended. It was the second time in 2 days that someone had said a version of that to him, which suggested that the people who knew him even partially could see something he was working to keep contained. He appreciated the warning. He didn't need it, but he appreciated it. He ate something at the kitchen table without tasting it. He checked his equipment without the SIG, which stayed locked in the garage exactly where it had been since Thursday night. He dressed in dark clothes that weren't tactical, just practical. Dark jeans, the black work jacket, boots with good ankle support. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. 42 years old. 16 years of accumulated capability that he had spent 6 years trying to convert into something that could exist in a house with a 12-year-old girl and a French press and drawings of stick-figure families on the refrigerator. He drove to Porter Street at 8:20 and parked 3 blocks north, in the lot behind a closed auto parts store, and walked the remaining distance through the industrial district's particular darkness. Sodium light pooling under widely spaced fixtures, long stretches of shadow between them, the smell of standing water and old asphalt, and the specific cold that collected in places where buildings absorbed heat and didn't give it back. The warehouse occupied most of the block. 3 stories of brick gone dark with age, windows broken at irregular intervals, chain-link perimeter with gaps that had been gaps for years. He circled it once on foot, moving along the shadows at the fence line, cataloging what he already knew from the research he'd done Friday afternoon. North entrance chained, chain corroded enough to yield under sustained pressure. East loading dock with a metal door hanging off one hinge, the gap wide enough to enter without touching the door itself. South wall backed against a strip of scrub growth, natural concealment that ran both ways. West face opened onto Porter Street itself, lit and exposed. He went in through the loading dock at 8:32, moving through the gap sideways, boots silent on the concrete threshold. The interior smell hit immediately, Mold and rust and decades of settled industrial residue, the specific staleness of a space that had been breathing its own air for too long. Moonlight entered through the broken windows in pale geometric shapes that shifted as clouds moved outside. He stood inside the doorway and let his eyes complete their adjustment. Kenneth was already there. Marcus located him by a micro-movement in the northeast corner, a shift of weight, barely perceptible, that someone who hadn't spent years tracking exactly that kind of signal would have missed entirely. Kenneth had positioned himself behind a section of collapsed industrial shelving that provided cover and a direct sightline to the central floor. Marcus didn't acknowledge him. They had agreed not to. The main floor was wide and open, what had once been a maneuvering space for forklifts and loading equipment, surrounded on three sides by catwalks 2 stories up, the railings incomplete, grated metal floors that would telegraph footsteps downward clearly. Marcus chose his position in the center of the space, back against a load-bearing column that was solid enough to matter, and waited. He thought about Owen Clark while he waited. Not the way he usually thought about him. The operational memory, the valley, the decision that had been made in fractions of a second with 8 lives on one side and 1 on the other. He thought about Owen the way you thought about someone you'd known before things got reduced to their worst moment. Owen had been 26 years old, from a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of man who remembered the names of other people's children and brought coffee to the briefing for whoever had been up longest. He had been good at his job with the particular goodness that came from caring about the people beside him rather than the metrics above him. Marcus had recommended him for advancement twice. He had visited the grave in Arlington every month for 9 years, 4 hours each way, because it was the only thing he could still do for a man he hadn't been able to save. Timothy Clark had never known any of that. He had known only the absence, the flag and the letter and the phone call that ended one version of his life and began another, worse one. At 8:58, footsteps entered from the east. 3 sets, the cadence Marcus had been expecting. Timothy in front, George White behind his right shoulder, Justin Nguyen moving immediately toward the catwalk stairs at the room's edge without being directed to. Justin had done this before, or been briefed to do it. The elevated position was the tactically correct call, which confirmed again that Timothy had planned tonight rather than improvised it. Timothy crossed the floor until he stood 20 feet from Marcus and stopped. He looked different from Saturday, not in any way Marcus could easily define, but the performance quality was gone. The leather jacket was the same, but the man inside it had shed whatever he'd been projecting at the cafe. What remained was quieter and more dangerous, the energy of someone who had made a decision so completely that ambivalence was no longer available to him. "You came alone," Timothy said, looking around the space with the assessment of someone checking their own work. "I came to talk." Marcus kept his weight centered, hands loose. "That's what you said you wanted." "I said we'd end this." Timothy looked at him steadily. "I don't know if that's the same thing." George White had positioned himself near the exit, bulk filling the doorway without quite blocking it, the implicit message clear. Justin was on the catwalk now, footsteps having stilled somewhere above and to Marcus's left. The geometry of the room had been arranged to limit Marcus's options, which was intelligent, and also told him that Timothy had expected Marcus to come ready for confrontation rather than conversation. "Your brother held a rear guard position in a valley." Marcus said it directly, the way you said things to men who had stopped having patience for approach. "He was ordered to fall back with the team. He refused. He told me to take the team out and he stayed. I tried to override the decision. He was immovable." A pause. 8 men made it to extraction because of what he did. I have thought about the math of that every day for 9 years, and I have never found a version of it that changes what Owen chose. Timothy's jaw worked. You had a choice. Go back for him or leave him. Going back meant 8 men died in a valley in the dark trying to recover 1 man who had already made his call. Owen knew that. He made his decision so that I wouldn't have to make mine. Marcus held his ground. "You've been carrying the wrong anger for 9 years. I understand why." I don't expect you to release it because I say so. But I need you to hear that the man you've built this entire campaign against, the one who left your brother to die for no reason, that man is a story you constructed because the truth was harder to carry." Something moved in Timothy's face, not softening, more like a fault line under pressure, not breaking but registering the force applied to it. He stood with it for 3 seconds, and then his expression closed again, the walls reasserting themselves with the practiced speed of someone who had spent years keeping that particular door shut. "You want me to believe Owen chose it? That makes it clean for you." His voice had a raw edge that hadn't been audible at the cafe. "I was the one who had to bury him. I was the one who had to go back to that town in Pennsylvania and sit in front of our mother and explain that her son wasn't coming home. You drove back to your base and you filed your report and you came home to your wife and your life and I—" He stopped, swallowed. "I had nothing left after Owen. You understand? Not a career, not a family, not a reason to stay sober, nothing. And you gotta just keep going." The warehouse held the silence for a moment. Marcus spoke carefully. "I didn't keep going untouched. I lost my wife 4 years after Owen. I left the Navy 3 weeks after her funeral because my daughter needed a father more than the service needed another operator. I built a life out of what was left, the same way anyone does, and I know that doesn't balance any equation for you, but I need you to understand that I didn't walk away from what happened without weight." "You walked away alive." Timothy said it like it was the only fact that mattered. "Owen didn't get that option. No, he didn't. And I've had to live with that being true every day since." The silence stretched. Above and to the left, Justin Nguyen was still. George White hadn't moved from the exit. The room breathed around them, old brick and cold air and the distant sound of a truck on Porter Street, ordinary Friday night traffic moving through a world that had no idea this conversation was happening. Marcus made the decision. "Owen wrote you a letter." Timothy went absolutely still. "The night before the operation. He gave it to me before we moved out. Said if he didn't come back, I needed to make sure it reached you." Marcus watched the stillness spread through Timothy's body, the particular quality of a man hearing something that has broken through every defense simultaneously. "I've had it for 9 years. It's in a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Arlington, Virginia, box 847, registered in my name. I never opened it." He held Timothy's eyes. "It was addressed to you. It wasn't mine to read." The breath Timothy drew was audible in the quiet. "You're lying." But the words had lost their purchase. They came out like something spoken from reflex rather than conviction, the automated response of a mind that hadn't yet caught up to what the rest of him was doing, which was breaking open in a way that had been building for 9 years and apparently needed only this one specific piece of information to begin. "I'm not. I drove to that cemetery in Arlington every month for 9 years, and I never went into that bank, because taking the letter out meant making a decision about what to do with it, and every option required me to either read it, which wasn't my right, or contact you, which—" Marcus paused. "I didn't think you were ready for, and I told myself that was about you, but it was also about me not being ready to revisit what that letter represented." Timothy's right hand had come up slightly, fingers not quite curled, a gesture that was reaching for something that wasn't there. He looked at Marcus with an expression Marcus had not seen on him before, not the cafe's performance rage, not the warehouse's cold strategic fury, but something stripped of all of that, something that looked like a man standing in a room he had not expected to enter. Above them, Justin Nguyen moved. Marcus heard it, the shift of weight on the catwalk grating, and registered it in the same instant that Timothy lifted his phone, thumb moving toward the screen. The phone showed a video feed. Rebecca's apartment, the kitchen table, the lamp she'd left on, the warm, ordinary geometry of an inhabited room. "One call," Timothy said, and his voice had the quality of a man forcing himself back into the plan he'd constructed when the plan had felt more certain. "I have someone outside her building. You've been predictable about who you protect, Marcus. That's a liability. "Check your messages," Kenneth said. Timothy spun. Kenneth Lee stepped out of the northeast corner, service weapon drawn and level, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had planned this exact moment and was not in any hurry about it. "Your associate has been in Officer Scott's custody for 23 minutes. Rebecca Sanchez is currently sitting in her car 3 blocks away, which she left approximately 90 minutes ago." A pause. "That feed is a loop. The timestamp hasn't changed in 2 hours because there's nothing left to update it." Timothy looked at the phone screen, looked at the timestamp, looked back at Kenneth. On the catwalk, Justin Nguyen made the worst decision available to him. The gunshot was concussive in the enclosed space, the sound bouncing off brick walls and concrete floor and returning from every direction simultaneously. The round sparked off concrete 6 feet from Kenneth, close enough to make the geometry extremely serious. Kenneth pivoted and returned fire in one motion. 2 rounds, controlled, the product of thousands of training hours that had never fully left his body, regardless of the years he'd spent behind a desk. Justin Nguyen's grip on the catwalk railing was the only thing that kept him from going over. He clutched it with his uninjured arm, the right shoulder of his jacket darkening rapidly, the pistol gone somewhere in the darkness below. He was alive and injured and no longer a threat, and Kenneth had already moved on. George White launched from the exit with the acceleration of a much smaller man, closing the distance to Marcus in under 2 seconds. Marcus sidestepped the initial charge, letting the momentum carry George past him, and caught the follow-up elbow with his forearm, deflecting the force upward. He moved inside George's reach and applied the elbow lock. The same fundamental geometry as Saturday's cafe encounter, the same reliance on anatomy over strength, and drove him down to the concrete with controlled downward pressure. George hit the floor and attempted to push up, and Marcus increased the angle by 4 degrees, which sent a clear message through the joint. George went still and stayed still. Kenneth had Timothy face down with a knee in his back, cuffing him with efficiency. Timothy wasn't fighting. He lay on the warehouse floor with his cheek against the cold concrete and his eyes closed, and he looked like a man who had finally stopped running toward something and was now simply resting in the place where the running ended. Pamela Scott came through the loading dock with 2 uniforms behind her, weapons raised, and assessed the room in 3 seconds. She moved immediately toward the catwalk stairs for Justin. Kenneth spoke into his radio. Marcus released George White and stepped back, hands visible, and a uniform moved in to take over. The warehouse filled with the sounds of professional aftermath, radio calls, medical requests, the efficient vocabulary of people processing a scene. Marcus stood in the center of it and breathed and let his heart rate find its way back toward something sustainable. Timothy was on his feet now, wrists cuffed behind him, and Kenneth was reciting his rights in a tone that managed to be professional and, beneath that, almost compassionate. The voice of a man who had heard the whole story and understood that the law's requirements and the human circumstances were 2 different things that sometimes had to occupy the same moment. Timothy looked at Marcus across the 6 feet between them. His face had the post-fracture quality of something that had broken along the fault lines that had always been there and was now simply open. "Owen wrote me a letter," he said, "and it wasn't accusatory. It wasn't anything except the sound of a man trying to make something real by saying it out loud." "He did." Marcus held his gaze. "And you can have it, whatever it says. That's the only thing I ever had that belonged to you, and I should have found a way to get it to you years ago." He paused. "I didn't. That's on me." Timothy looked at him for a long moment. "He told you to hold it for me." "He knew you well enough to know you'd need time before you could hear it." Something moved across Timothy's face that might, in a different context, in a different version of this night, have been the beginning of something. He looked away. Kenneth guided him toward the exit with a hand on his arm that was firm and also careful, and George White followed with a uniform on each side, and then Pamela Scott was calling down from the catwalk that Justin Nguyen was stable and conscious and needed an ambulance, and the warehouse's particular version of this night was over. Marcus stood in the middle of the floor for a moment after everyone else had moved toward the exits. The cold air moved through the broken windows and the moonlight shifted on the concrete, and somewhere outside, the ambulance siren was starting up from wherever it had been waiting. He looked at his watch. The second hand swept its steady arc. The crystal was cracked in the upper left corner. He walked out. The scene outside on Porter Street was the organized brightness of emergency response. 2 ambulances, 3 cruisers, the white utility lighting of first responders working. Kenneth appeared at Marcus's shoulder after 10 minutes and walked him to the edge of the scene, away from the activity. "You handled tonight exactly right," Kenneth said. It wasn't flattery, just the assessment of someone who had watched the sequence and was reporting accurately. It felt like barely controlled chaos from inside. That's what it always feels like from inside. Kenneth looked at the warehouse. From outside, it looked like a man who understood violence well enough to choose something else. A pause. "I need you at the station for a statement. Full account, everything from Saturday forward." "I know." "And Marcus." Kenneth looked at him directly. "The letter. Tell me about the letter." Marcus told him. Box number, bank address, everything. Kenneth wrote it down in his notebook with the careful handwriting of someone who understood that the details mattered. When he finished writing, he looked up. "You want me to get it to him?" "I want him to have it before he dies. However that has to happen. Prison, hospice, wherever he ends up. That letter has been waiting 9 years. It shouldn't wait any longer." Kenneth nodded once, the nod of a man who understood the weight of an obligation. He extended his hand. Marcus shook it. The statement took until nearly 1 in the morning, 3 hours in a room with Kenneth and a recording device and a legal pad. Marcus working through the full sequence from the cafe encounter to the warehouse, every text message, every call, every contact point, the photograph of Nicole, the ramp, the surveillance outside the school. Kenneth asked clarifying questions that were designed to build the record prosecutors would need. Marcus answered them plainly and completely, and didn't minimize or editorialize. When it was done, Kenneth reviewed his notes and said the case against Timothy was solid on conspiracy, stalking, and the weapons charge attached to Justin Nguyen, whose cooperation was already being negotiated from his hospital bed. Marcus drove home through empty streets. The house was dark and quiet, which was different from the dark quiet of the past week. This had the quality of resolution rather than waiting. He sat in the truck in the driveway for a while without getting out, looking at the workshop through the windshield, the siding he'd installed board by board, the light above the door that he left on at night. His phone buzzed. "Kenneth, spoke to Arlington PD tonight. They'll retrieve the letter Monday morning. I'll make sure he gets it." Marcus typed back, "Thank you." He sat for another minute. Then he went inside, checked the locks from habit rather than necessity, and slept. He slept without dreaming for the first time in a week. Saturday morning arrived with the specific clarity that followed 2 days of weather, sky scrubbed clean, pale March sunlight with genuine warmth in it for the first time since fall. Marcus made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, and the swing set in the corner, and the workshop, and the fence line, and it all looked the same as it had looked for 6 years, which was the whole point. He called Sandra Anderson at 8:30. Her voice carried the easy relief of someone who had been waiting for a particular call and was glad it had finally come. "Everything okay?" "It's handled. I'll be there around 3. He spent the morning in the workshop. The walnut table was still there, still unfinished, still waiting for someone to give it the attention it deserved. He picked up the hand plane and started on the final surface pass, the blade taking thin, curling shavings from the wood, the grain emerging under the tool with the gradual revelation of something that had always been there waiting to be uncovered. The work came easily now, the measurements landing exactly where he set them, his hands doing what they'd always been capable of doing when the frequency had somewhere to go besides the inside of his skull. He worked for 3 hours and finished the surface preparation and started on the final coat of oil, working it into the wood in long, even strokes. The walnut went dark and rich under the oil, the figure in the grain deepening, and Marcus worked and didn't think about much, which was the thing he'd always loved about this kind of work. It required enough precision to occupy the conscious mind and left the rest of him alone. At 2:15 his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He looked at it for a moment before opening it. I read it. He told me to forgive you. Said you were the best CO he ever served under and that the choice was his and he was proud of it. Said I needed to stop drinking and stop looking backward and find something to live toward even if it was small. A pause, in the form of a gap before the next line. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I'm going to try. For him. Marcus read it twice. Then he saved the number under Owen's brother and set the phone face down on the workbench and stood with both hands on the edge of the table and looked at the wood he'd been working on and breathed. He didn't reply. The message hadn't asked him to. It was an offering rather than a request, the first movement of something that might become, over time, if both of them survived the process, something that resembled peace. He wasn't going to crowd it with words. He drove north at 2:30, the truck on the highway through the greening Vermont landscape, and arrived at the farm at 3:12, which was slightly later than he'd said, and Sandra didn't comment on it. Nicole was in the paddock brushing Sandra's mare, moving the brush in long, even strokes along the horse's flank, and she saw the truck come up the drive and her face broke into the expression that Marcus had been carrying the whole drive up without being able to fully access. The unguarded relief of someone who had been holding something together alone and could finally set it down. She put the brush on the fence post and jogged over and climbed into the truck and looked at him with the full assessment of someone taking inventory. "You okay?" Her voice was careful, not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she understood the precision the question required. "Getting there," Marcus said. She looked at him for a moment longer, running whatever calculation 12-year-olds ran when they were deciding whether adults were telling the truth, and then she nodded once, with the particular finality of someone who has decided to extend trust as a deliberate choice rather than a default. "Okay," she said simply. He pulled out of the farm and headed south. They talked for the first half hour about the horses, about what Emma had texted, about the blue paint waiting on her bedroom walls, and then they fell into the comfortable silence that didn't require anything from either of them. The landscape moved past the windows, Vermont giving way to New Hampshire, the familiar geometry of home reassembling itself mile by mile. "Was it about his brother?" Nicole asked. She was looking out the windshield, not at him. "Yes." "Did you fix it?" He thought about that for a moment. "I gave him back something that belonged to him. Whether that fixes anything is up to him." She sat with that. "That's kind of sad." "Yeah, it is. But it's also the right thing." "Yeah," he said. "It is." They stopped for dinner at the diner Nicole had chosen every time since she was 8, a place with vinyl booth seats and a dessert case that rotated and pancakes available all day, which she had always considered one of the most important features a restaurant could offer. She ordered pancakes because dinner pancakes were categorically superior to breakfast pancakes, a position she had held for 4 years and defended with surprising rigor. Marcus ordered coffee and eggs and listened to her talk about the soccer assist and the science project and whether the paint she'd chosen was going to look different once it dried on all 4 walls. And he did not think about Timothy Clark or the warehouse or the weeks that had just passed. He thought about his daughter and the eggs on his plate and the coffee in his cup and the particular quality of ordinary that only revealed its full value when you'd been close enough to losing it to feel the weight. They drove home in the dark. Nicole fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere past Concord, head tilting toward the window, and Marcus drove in the quiet and let her sleep. At home he carried her bag inside while she managed the journey from truck to couch in the half-conscious shuffle of someone who wasn't quite ready to wake up. He covered her with the blanket from the back of the couch and turned the lights down and went to the workshop. He stood at the finished table surface and ran his palm across the wood. The oil had cured during the drive. The grain was open and rich, the joinery clean, every surface true. He'd been commissioned to build a table for a family in Concord to gather around, and he had built it well, and tomorrow he would deliver it, and the following week there would be another commission, and the week after that, and the work would continue, and his daughter would keep growing, and the house would keep settling on its foundation, and the watch on his wrist would keep running 11 seconds fast. He turned off the workshop light and stood outside for a moment in the cold March air, looking up. The sky over Portsmouth was clear enough to show stars through the ambient light, a scattering of them, the permanent ones that had been there before any of this and would be there after. Owen Clark had looked at some version of this sky from a valley 9 years ago and made a decision that Marcus had spent 9 years carrying. Timothy Clark was looking at the sky from a holding cell tonight, reading a letter that had been waiting for him since before his world ended, and whatever it did or didn't change was now between him and his brother. Marcus was here, in his backyard, with his daughter asleep on the couch and his workshop locked, and the walnut table finished and ready to go. That was enough. It had always been enough, and it would always be enough, and the work of his remaining life was to keep choosing it, the ordinary, the present, the imperfect and irreplaceable weight of being exactly where he was, over everything that had tried to pull him somewhere else. He went inside and locked the door, and went to bed. Wednesday morning came bright and cold, the light at that particular March angle that hit windows horizontally and turned dust motes in the air into small gold fires. Marcus walked into the Riverside Cafe at 8:40, and Ashley had his coffee poured before he reached the booth. He said thank you, and meant it, and wrapped both hands around the mug and sat with his back to the wall and looked at the room with its regulars and its Saturday morning energy, and felt the particular quality of a place that had resumed being what it was. Rebecca Sanchez came in at 9 on the dot. She navigated to her usual spot with the efficiency that Marcus had watched from across the room for months, and she transferred, and she folded the chair, and she pulled out her laptop. Then she looked at him across the cafe and lifted her coffee cup slightly, the same kind of gesture the crossword man had made 9 days ago, and Marcus returned it. She moved to the booth across from him. She turned her laptop screen so he could see it, a rendering, color, detailed, showing a playground with ramps instead of steps, sensory panels at accessible heights, swings with structural support harnesses, a wide surface treatment that would accommodate wheels without resistance. Clean and functional and genuinely beautiful, the kind of design that solved problems while looking like it wasn't trying. "Grant came through," she said. "Construction starts in July, right here in Portsmouth." He looked at the rendering. He thought about what it would take to build it, the structural framing, the surface installation, the custom elements that would require someone who understood how wood and load and precision interacted. He thought about the workshop behind his house and the tools in it, and the commission that had already been delivered, and the space in the calendar that was currently empty. "I could help build it," he said. "I'm good with structural wood." She looked at him steadily, with the directness that he'd come to understand was simply how she processed the world. No buffer, no performance. "I know," she said. "I was counting on it." They talked until her coffee went cold. Not about Timothy or the warehouse or the weeks that had just ended, about the playground design, the specific engineering problems in the accessible surface treatment, the timeline for permits, the neighborhood where it would sit. About the work, which was the right thing to talk about. Work was how things got built. Work was how the world became different from what it had been. When she said she needed to get to her office and started packing her laptop, Marcus looked at the room one more time. Ashley refilling the crossword man's cup, the college kid with his headphones, 2 women at the center table laughing about something, and felt the cafe settle around him the way it had settled every Saturday morning for 2 years. The booth with its worn laminate and its view of the entrance, the coffee that was strong enough to mean it, the ordinary accumulation of a life that was his. His phone buzzed. He looked at it out of reflex, the old vigilance, and then he looked at the screen. "Kenneth. Letter confirmed, delivered this morning. His lawyer says he's reading it now." A pause before the next line. "Judge granted compassionate release hearing for next Thursday. Likely outcome is hospice transfer." Marcus set the phone on the table face down. He looked out the window at Porter Street in the morning light, traffic moving, people on the sidewalk living their Friday mornings forward. Owen Clark's last words to his brother were being read in a county holding facility 3 miles from where Marcus was sitting, and whatever those words said was between Owen and Timothy, the way it had always been meant to be. He had carried it for 9 years. He had set it down. He did not need to pick it up again. He left a 10 on the table and said goodbye to Ashley and walked out into the March morning, the air cold and clean and carrying, for the first time this year, an undercurrent of something warmer underneath, the season making its slow, reliable argument that it was coming regardless of what the cold had to say about it. He drove home. Nicole's soccer bag was by the front door. Next Saturday's game circled on the kitchen calendar in her handwriting. The walnut table was gone, delivered, a check deposited. The workshop was clean and ready for the next thing. He made a second cup of coffee and stood at the window and watched the backyard come into the morning light, and he thought about what you built when you stopped building toward the past, and decided that the answer was this: the ordinary forward motion of a life chosen daily, one decision at a time, impermanent and sufficient, and entirely worth the cost of protecting.